Chapter 16. A Matter of Propriety. A piercing shriek echoed through the entrance hall of the Brocket estate, causing several birds to take startled flight from their perches on the crumbling windowsills. "Isabella Brocket! What in heaven's name is the meaning of this abomination?" Mrs. Brocket's voice quivered with unbridled fury as she stood transfixed before what appeared to be a makeshift flagpole, from which hung an item of intimate apparel that had clearly seen better days. Isabella lounged against the banister, a look of studied indifference upon her face. "Oh, that! I thought the entrance hall needed a conversation piece, Mother, something to enliven our dreary existence." "A conversation piece!" Mrs. Brocket's nostrils flared like those of an agitated horse. "These are your... She gestured wildly at the offending garment. "Knickers," Isabella supplied helpfully. 5 days worn, to be precise. I thought the patterner would add a certain je ne sais quoi." Mrs. Brocket's face contorted into expressions unknown to human physiognomy. "You have become positively feral. This is what comes of reading those philosophical treatises your father keeps lying about." The commotion drew Marianne from the drawing-room. She approached the scene with wide-eyed fascination. "Oh, how peculiar! It rather reminds me of that time I saw a bat hanging upside down in the dairy, except the bat was much less fragrant, though I suppose bats don't wear undergarments unless they're fashionable." "Silence!" Mrs. Brocket commanded. "This is no time for your meandering observations about sartorially inclined flying mammals." Mr. Brocket emerged from his study, peering over his spectacles at the unusual display. "I see Isabella has taken up vexillology," he remarked dryly, "though I must say the traditional materials for flag making are somewhat more conventional." "Henry!" Mrs. Brocket rounded on her husband. "Do not stand there making obtuse observations. Your eldest daughter has mounted her undergarments on a stick in our entrance hall." "Mounted?" Catherine appeared at the top of the stairs, her journal clutched to her chest. "Like a hunting trophy. How frightfully Gothic!" "It's a protest, actually," Isabella announced, examining her fingernails, "against the suffocating constraints of propriety and the oppressive nature of maternal expectations." "Suffocating!" Mrs. Brocket's voice reached a pitch that threatened the integrity of the already precarious chandelier. "I'll show you suffocating! Mabel! Mabel!" Mabel materialized from whatever corner she had been lurking in, wearing her customary expression of sullen defiance. "You don't have to shout, I ain't deaf, though I might be wishing I didn't have me other senses, given the smell." "Remove this manifestation of depravity at once." "I ain't touching that," Mabel declared firmly. "Ain't in my contract to 'andle young ladies' unmentionables, especially when they've been mentioned quite enough already." "Everything is in your contract," Mrs. Brocket insisted. "I specifically remember including a clause about the removal of inappropriate articles from inappropriate places." "That was about the cat, what kept leaving dead mice in your bonnet box," Mabel corrected. "Different sort of unpleasantness altogether." Mrs. Brocket turned back to Isabella, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You have precisely 3 minutes to remove this disgrace before I take measures that will make your little protest seem like a pleasant afternoon tea party." "But, Mother," Isabella replied with exaggerated patience, "removing it would rather defeat the purpose. The purpose being to highlight the absurdity of your obsession with appearances and social climbing. Besides, I thought you always wanted us to make a lasting impression on visitors." "A lasting impression?" Mrs. Brocket's laugh held all the warmth of a January frost. The only lasting impression this will make is that the Brockets have descended into complete savagery. What if Lady Uppington were to call? Then she would finally see the truth behind our facade of gentility, Isabella replied. Rather refreshing, don't you think? Marianne had been studying the display with her head tilted at an odd angle. It does cast the most interesting shadow on the wall, rather like a flag of surrender, except surrendering flags are usually cleaner and less personal. If this is surrender, Catherine mused, scribbling frantically in her journal, what precisely has been surrendered? Dignity? Decorum? The very foundations of civilized society? My sanity, Mrs. Brockett muttered. That's what's being surrendered, along with any hope of maintaining our position in society. She straightened suddenly, her eyes gleaming with dangerous inspiration. Very well, Isabella. If you insist on this display of derangement, we shall see it through to its logical conclusion, perhaps a few days in more. Structured surroundings would help restore your sense of propriety. Are you threatening to have me committed, Mother? Isabella's tone suggested this possibility had already occurred to her and found wanting. How delightfully medieval of you. Mr. Brockett cleared his throat. My dear, perhaps we might consider a less dramatic... Henry, unless you have a solution that doesn't involve quoting dead philosophers at me, I suggest you return to your study. As you wish, he replied, though he paused to add, though I believe it was Voltaire who said something rather pertinent about the relationship between authority and ridicule. Out! Mabel, who had been watching the proceedings with poorly concealed enjoyment, chose this moment to offer her thoughts. If ye ask me... Nobody is asking you, Mrs. Brockett snapped. Mother, Marianne interjected suddenly. Speaking of French writing, did you know that Marie Antoinette once displayed her stockings in the Palace of Versailles? Though I might have dreamed that. I often dream about stockings and cheese, sometimes both at once. Mrs. Brockett closed her eyes, visibly counting to 10. When she opened them, her voice was eerily calm. Isabella, you have brought this upon yourself. When you find yourself confined to a room with padded walls, I do hope you'll reflect on how your artistic expression might have been better channeled into watercolours or the pianoforte like any normal young lady. Normal? Isabella scoffed. In this household? That ship sailed long ago, Mother. Probably on a sea of propriety, weighed down with the corpses of spontaneity and truth. What a vivid metaphor, Catherine murmured, her pen flying across the pages of her journal, though perhaps a bit maritime for a family that lives nowhere near the sea. The thunderous knock at the front door sent Mrs. Brockett into a paroxysm of panic. Through the frosted glass, she could make out the unmistakable silhouette of Mr. Reginald Ponsonby Smythe, an eligible bachelor whose interest in the Brockett daughters she had been carefully cultivating. Mabel, she hissed, answer the door, and Isabella, if you do not remove that repugnant banner this instant. Can't answer the door, Mabel called from somewhere upstairs. Busy polishing the... something that needs polishing. Mrs. Brockett lunged for the offending undergarment, but Isabella had secured it with surprising ingenuity. The knock came again. Just a moment, Mrs. Brockett trilled in her most refined voice, while frantically attempting to position herself in front of the display. Marianne, fetch that large potted fern from the drawing-room. The dead one or the dying one? Marianne asked cheerfully. Either! Both! Just hurry! Mr. Ponsonby Smythe's carefully arranged features came into view as the door creaked open. Mrs. Brockett, he said, bowing stiffly. "I trust I find you well." "Exceedingly." Mrs. Brocket's voice carried a hint of hysteria as she maintained her strategic position. "Though we are in the midst of some minor renovations, perhaps we might repair to the drawing room." "I observed the most peculiar thing through your window," he continued, attempting to peer around her. "Something that appeared to be—" "The new fashion from London," Mrs. Brockett blurted, "for improving the circulation of air. Quite revolutionary. Marianne, where is that fern?" Marianne appeared, struggling with an enormous pot containing what looked like a cluster of brown twigs. "Here it is, Mother, though I'm not sure it's feeling very social today. It's been rather morose since the incident with the cat." "Ah, Mr. Ponsonby Smythe," Mr. Brockett emerged from his study. "I've just been reading the most fascinating treatise on the decline of Roman civilization, rather pertinent to current events, wouldn't you say?" Mrs. Brockett shot her husband a look that could have shattered granite. "I must say," Mr. Ponsonby Smythe began, his nose twitching, "there is a most unusual aroma." "Mabel's experimental cooking," Mrs. Brockett practically shouted. "We've been attempting to expand her culinary repertoire, without success, I'm afraid. Now, shall we—" "Ain't been near the kitchen all day," Mabel's voice floated down. "And that smell ain't cooking, that's—" "Mabel!" Mr. Ponsonby Smythe had finally managed to sidestep Mrs. Brockett, bringing Isabella's handiwork into full view. His face underwent a remarkable transformation, beginning with confusion, progressing through comprehension, and finally settling on horror. "Good Lord," he whispered. "It's a commentary on social conventions," Isabella offered helpfully from her perch on the stairs. "The juxtaposition of the private and public spheres, if you will." I see." He didn't. "Like a flag of surrender," Marianne added brightly, "except it's surrendering to the inevitable decay of propriety, or possibly moths. We do have rather a lot of moths." Catherine, who had been furiously writing throughout, looked up. "Would you say, Mr. Ponsonby Smythe, that your reaction represents the typical masculine response to such an overt challenge to societal norms? I'm taking notes for my novel." "Your novel?" His complexion had taken on the pallor of old porridge. "Oh, yes. It's about a young woman who gradually descends into madness after being forced to attend too many social functions. Though I might change it to be about undergarments now. This is much more interesting." Mrs. Brockett made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Mr. Ponsonby Smythe, I assure you this is all a terrible misunderstanding. Isabella has been reading some rather inflammatory literature—" "French philosophy," Mr. Brockett interjected. "Though I doubt Rousseau ever considered this particular form of social contract." "And she's not herself today. Perhaps we might discuss this over tea." But Mr. Ponsonby Smythe was already backing toward the door, his hat clutched to his chest like a shield. That is to say, I just remembered an urgent appointment with my aunt, who is very ill, possibly dying. I really must." "But surely you can't leave without hearing Isabella's full dissertation on the symbolism," Marianne said. "She hasn't even gotten to the part about the stick representing the rigid backbone of society. At least I assume that's what it represents, unless it's just a stick." "Good day!" Mr. Ponsonby Smythe practically fled, his coat-tails flapping behind him as he hurried down the drive. Mrs. Brockett watched him go, her dreams of a socially advantageous marriage evaporating like morning mist. She turned to Isabella with glacial calm. I hope you're satisfied, she said. You've just driven away one of the most eligible bachelors in the county. Oh, I am satisfied, Isabella replied. Though I must say, if his sensibilities are so easily offended by a pair of knickers, imagine how he'd react to actual marriage. They ain't just knickers anymore, Mabel observed, having finally appeared to witness the aftermath. They're what them artists call a statement piece now. Indeed, Mr. Brockett mused, though perhaps more statement than piece at this point. Mrs. Brockett's composure finally shattered. This is beyond bearing. Beyond propriety, Isabella suggested. Sanitation, added Marianne. The bounds of rational thought, Mr. Brockett offered. Beyond everything. Mrs. Brockett's voice reached a crescendo that set the chandelier tinkling ominously. Mark my words, Isabella Brockett. This act of rebellion will have consequences. Severe consequences. Consequences that will make you wish you'd never learned to dress yourself. That seems a bit extreme, Marianne reflected. Though I suppose if she couldn't dress herself, we wouldn't be in this situation, unless she found some other way to make her point. Maybe with a tablecloth? Or one of Father's cravats? Mrs. Brockett swept toward the stairs, pausing only to deliver one final threat. Stay right where you are, all of you. This situation will be resolved today, even if I have to call every authority figure in Lesser Mudbury. Does that include the chimney sweep? Marianne called after her. Because he did say he had some strong opinions about proper ventilation. The only response was the sound of Mrs. Brockett's bedroom door slamming with enough force to dislodge several flakes of ceiling plaster. Fortune, in its infinite capacity for mischief, delivered Dr. Blackwood to the Brockett doorstep precisely as Mrs. Brockett was contemplating which authority would be most likely to cart her eldest daughter away. Dr. Blackwood! Mrs. Brockett's face transformed into a mask of maternal concern. How providential! I was just about to send for you. We have a most disturbing situation with Isabella. The doctor, a man whose expression suggested he had seen enough of the Brocketts' disturbing situations to last several lifetimes, sighed. I was actually here to discuss your outstanding account, Mrs. Brockett, but outstanding account? Nonsense! Far more pressing matters at hand. Do come in and observe my daughter's descent into complete derangement. The doctor found himself steered into the entrance hall, where the unusual display remained proudly aloft. He blinked several times, adjusted his spectacles, and blinked again. You see? Mrs. Brockett gestured dramatically. Clear signs of mental deterioration. I fear she may need to be contained. For her own good, naturally. I'm perfectly sound of mind, Isabella called down, unless refusing to conform to Mother's suffocating standards of propriety is now considered a form of madness. Dr. Blackwood cleared his throat. Mrs. Brockett, while this is certainly an unconventional form of expression, I'm not sure it qualifies as... Perhaps we might discuss this privately, Mrs. Brockett interrupted, steering him toward the morning room. Mabel, tea! Can't, came the reply from some unseen corner. Sprained me tea-pouring arm. In the morning room, Mrs. Brockett closed the door and lowered her voice. Doctor, surely you understand the gravity of the situation. My daughter has mounted her undergarments on a pole for all of Lesser Mudbury to see. If that's not a sign of mental instability, I don't know what is. Well, actually... Mrs. Brockett reached into her reticule and withdrew a small purse. I believe this might help clarify your medical opinion, and of course it would cover that trifling, outstanding account you mentioned. The doctor's principles wavered visibly as he weighed the purse in his hand. I suppose certain forms of temporary restraint might be beneficial in cases of acute social rebellion. Excellent. Mrs. Brocket's smile held all the warmth of a midwinter frost. I believe a few days in your establishment's most instructive accommodations would do wonders for her condition. When they returned to the entrance hall, Isabella had been joined by her sisters. Marianne was attempting to teach the dead fern a dance step, while Catherine scribbled what appeared to be an epic poem about undergarments and social decay. Isabella, Mrs. Brockett announced with barely contained triumph, Dr. Blackwood agrees that you require some time in a more structured environment. Does he indeed? Isabella raised an eyebrow at the doctor, who had the grace to look somewhat ashamed. How fascinating that medical science has advanced to the point where it can diagnose madness through bribery. Now, Dr. Blackwood mumbled. This is merely a precautionary measure. Oh, do let me come too, Marianne brightened. I've always wanted to see a madhouse. Do they really serve gruel 3 times a day? And are the walls actually padded? Or is that just a rumour? I've often thought our walls could use padding, especially when Mother's in one of her moods. Nobody else is going anywhere, though, Marianne, I will keep you in mind, Mrs. Brockett snapped. Doctor, if you would be so kind as to escort Isabella to your firmest establishment. I ain't helping, Mabel announced from her latest hiding spot. Last time I got involved in one of your schemes, I ended up stuck in that tree for 3 hours. That was entirely different and completely your own fault. Mrs. Brockett turned back to the doctor. Shall we proceed? What followed was a brief but chaotic scene involving several failed attempts to approach Isabella, who displayed surprising agility in evading capture. The doctor, wheezing slightly, finally managed to grasp her arm. I suppose this means I've won, Isabella remarked calmly as she was led to the door. Nothing says I'm right quite like being dragged off to the madhouse. Mrs. Brockett was still savouring her victory when, not 2 hours later, Mabel shuffled in with news from the town. Seems your plan ain't worked out quite like you hoped, she announced with poorly concealed glee. Young Miss gave the doctor the slip just past the church, last seen dancing a jig at the Fox and Ferret, standing on a table and lecturing about the tyranny of proper undergarments. Mrs. Brockett's cry of despair sent several more chunks of plaster raining down from the ceiling. And that ain't the half of it, Mabel went on, grinning. Rumour as it she's setting up a protest march. Got a bunch of young ladies in town ready to wave their smalls about like flags. They're dubbing it the Knicker Rebellion of 1815. The what? Mrs. Brockett's voice had gone dangerously quiet. Catchy name, ain't it? Though some reckon the underwear uprising sounds better. Mr. Brockett peered out from his study. I believe this is what historians would call a watershed moment, though perhaps that's not the most appropriate term under the circumstances. Oh, how wonderful! Marianne clapped her hands. Do you think they'll write songs about it? I've already thought of one. Would anyone like to hear it? It's called The Ballad of the Rebellious Breeches. Mrs. Brockett sank onto the stairs, her expression suggesting she had just witnessed the end of civilization itself. My daughter, she whispered, has become a revolutionary, with undergarments as her banner. Look on the bright side, Catherine offered, still writing furiously. This will make an excellent chapter in my novel. I'm thinking of calling it Seams and Sensibility. I suppose, Mrs. Brockett said faintly, this is what comes of allowing young ladies to read books that aren't about needlework or proper deportment. That's the spirit, Marianne beamed. Though I do think needlework might have helped. The knickers would probably have stayed up better if Isabella had used a stronger stitch. Mrs. Brocket's only response was a sound that suggested her soul was trying to escape through her teeth.